Well, thanks, Nick and Scott, for great memories of an incredible man. Thanks to the AFS-OC for allowing us to have this session, and Nick for organizing. Before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge that this presentation is the result of memories that were contributed by many of us at DFO. So Karl Lamothe, Jason Barnous, Robin Gaspardi, and Sean Staten. And so I'm going to be talking about some work that DFO has been doing on trying to move conservation translocations forward, really in tribute to Al, because Al felt very strongly about the role of conservation translocations in species recovery in Ontario and in Canada. So I'd like to start with this photo. This is a picture that we took at Al's kind of honorary DFO retirement party. Of course, Al was not a DFO employee, but many of us considered him to be an honorary DFO employee because of the number of collaborations that he had with DFO. And, you know, there are three presents here that Al's holding. One is a bottle of port. Two is a cigar, and I'll get to that in a second. And three, most importantly, is a Tom O'Leary print of a river red horse. And the cigar signifies a moment that happened nearly two decades prior to Al's retirement, where Al was presented with a cigar from from Sean Staten, a DFO employee, for all of his work, his blood, sweat, and tears in leading the Sydenham River recovery team and finally developing the Sydenham River recovery strategy. So this photo that some of you may have seen is Al enjoying that initial cigar following the completion of the Sydenham River recovery strategy. And so we all had a wonderful sushi lunch with Al celebrating his retirement from public service with the province of Ontario. So what I'd like to do is provide a brief overview of Al's PhD research. I'll then talk about how Al paved the way for Eastern Sand Darter reintroductions in Ontario, and then close with some thoughts about Al, both as a colleague and as a friend. So as we've heard, Al completed his PhD later in life. It is remarkable to me that he was able to put together such a comprehensive thesis while working full-time. This thesis remains the best investigation of Eastern Sand Darter in Canada, full stop. It was a comprehensive Ontario range-wide analysis of extant and extirpated populations. As we've heard from Scott, it was novel, using concepts around imperfect detection and occupancy probability, which really had not been applied to fish sampling in Canada in this way. And it did so in a multi-scale investigation. So thinking about Eastern Sand Darter occupancy at the reach level, at the valley level, and at the watershed scale. Al's thesis had, many important takeaways, and I think the most important is what both Nick and Scott have talked about, which is that it really paved the way for thinking about the perils and the consequences of imperfect detection. But from a species recovery standpoint, it had many important implications for Eastern Sand Darter management in Ontario. Al looked at the role of many different competing variables in terms of their ability to predict Eastern Sand Darter occupancy and density. And one of the major takeaways is that sand and fine gravel are really important predictors of occupancy and density for this species. He also was really interested in the role of dams in watersheds and how they led to different patterns of substrate deposition, and then in turn how that influenced the distribution of Eastern Sand Darter. So on the right-hand side here is a great figure that was developed in Al's thesis that looked at the probability that Eastern Sand Darter would occupy an area based on the distance upstream of a dam. Al told me a story once about how one of his committee members had suggested that, in addition to all this very rigorous quantitative work he was doing, that maybe he should think about the role of spatial autocorrelation in terms of how it impacts occupancy probability. And Al lovingly referred to these as the dark days in R. And you have to keep in mind that Al was doing his thesis work, part-time, as we've heard, at a time where R was really just starting to become, a common tool in the ecological sciences. And, he talked very openly about the challenges he was having in R and the challenges in getting these models to converge and, how spatial autocorrelation was really pushing him to his limit in terms of his ability to kind of think through these model assumptions and these outcomes. But nonetheless, he did persevere, and spatial autocorrelation was a really important part of his thesis. One of the things that was remarkable about Al is that he had such keen attention to detail, and I have never come across a grad student who put together such a well-organized database. So these are some screenshots of some supplementary material that Al put together of his Eastern Sanddarter thesis database, which he lovingly called Muck Perch version 2.1. And it is just beautifully organized. And Al's hope was that people could carry on his work, that that his field data, although focused on Eastern Sanddarter, could be used to look at imperfect detection of white sucker or other common species. And so he took a lot of time to annotate his database and make sure that those who came after him would be able to put together his research in a way that was useful to the scientific community. Now, one of the reasons that Al initiated his thesis was to think about how we could use the results of these occupancy models for reintroduction of Eastern Sanddarter. And at the time when Al conducted his research, we had what we thought were three extant populations, or two extant populations in Ontario, the Grand River population and the Thames River population. And it was assumed at the time that Eastern Sanddarter was extirpated from Big Creek. But lo and behold, through the fieldwork that Al did, and we heard from Nick about just the tremendous number of field days that Al put in for his thesis, he discovered that Eastern Sanddarter was in fact still present in Big Creek. And I believe it was a Canada Day sampling with his wife Helen where Al discovered Eastern Sanddarter. But nonetheless, that left two remaining populations, the Osable River and Big Otter Creek, that were extirpated. And Al felt really strongly about the use of conservation translocations for moving species conservation forward. And I remember, in 2017, we had a scoping workshop for what would then become the Canadian Freshwater Species at Risk Research Network. And Al was sitting at a table with Scott, and he was, scribbling away on a pad of paper as he tended to do. And he came up to me at the break and he said, "Andrew, I've come up with the Eastern Sanddarter translocation plan." And I don't know if people can read what's on the screen here, but in the little comment bubble it says "add fish and stir." And that was a great reflection of Al saying, look, we need this work to be scientifically rigorous, but we also don't want to be paralyzed with analysis. And there is an important role for moving some of this work forward in a sound, scientifically supported way, but also doing it as an experiment. He also felt really strongly about using the term repatriation, not reintroduction. And unfortunately, that really hasn't seemed to stick in the literature. Al was quick to point out to us that the IUCN had come up with species translocation guidelines, and he felt that those guidelines were a really good starting point for thinking about how to evaluate the suitability of any given translocation. And so it's through Al's guidance and pointing out the kind of wisdom of those guidelines that Karl Lamothe and several of us from DFO have been kind of adopting those guidelines in a DFO context to think about the information that we need to move conservation translocations forward. And so this is a figure from the DFO decision support framework for conservation translocations. And like so many products that have come out from species at risk science, they have had roots in either conversations or meetings with Al. Al was a really important member of the DFO Eastern Sanddarter Reintroduction Working Group, or as he liked to refer to it as the Muck Perch Repatriation Summit. As Scott mentioned, he had just a way with words and always injected humor into everything that he did from a work perspective. Al's thesis work continues to inform models and analysis that we're doing as part of that reintroduction working group. Just recently, we used his Thames River data to come up with indices of abundance for eastern sand darter in the Thames, because it represented our best field data set for eastern sand darter almost 15 years later. And again, thinking about Al's humor, during one of our reintroduction working group meetings, we were thinking about kind of the risks and the benefits of doing the eastern sand darter translocation. And in particular, we were thinking about, well, what is the potential to see transformational ecosystem change as a risk, right? How concerned should we be about this? And, we went around the room and people are kind of weighing in on the potential for that to occur. And the general consensus is the room is that, we're probably very unlikely to see transformational ecosystem change following an eastern sand darter reintroduction. But just at the last minute, Al said, well, unless you're an ostracod. And within 30 seconds, he had emailed this picture of an ostracod with a comment bubble saying, "What about us?" And just a great example of Al's perspective, his wit, and his wisdom. And, on the final topic of reintroduction, I'd like to read this quote because I think it really embodies so many things about Al. So this was an email that Al sent to me during the midst of our Eastern Sand Darter reintroduction working group meetings, where he was thinking about, how close are we to actually reintroducing this fish? And he said, I quote, "If a developing nation like India can move forward to repatriate a charismatic megafaunal species that is also a deadly predator with huge sharp claws and teeth and can outrun a Ford Focus, then surely the great nation of Canada can dump a couple of thousand translucent little fish that rarely get larger than 70 millimeters, have minute little teeth, and prey upon chironomids and ostracods into suitable habitat that is largely already protected, including 200 meters of riparian lands, because of a couple of lowly gomphids, i.e. dragonflies. I firmly believe we have enough data and appropriate habitat to make it happen and should be ready to proceed with a well-planned, experimental, responsible repatriation with significant public outreach sooner than later." And the reason I like that quote is that it provides a lot of perspective. It has Al's great humor, and it demonstrates his strong desire to move conservation initiatives forward when they are well supported by a sound body of science. So I'd like to close this presentation by thinking about attributes that Al demonstrated as a colleague and as a friend. And, when I think about Al and I think about all the collaborations we had, the first thing that really comes to mind is that he was authoritative, meaning if you wanted the definitive word about something, whether it was related to science topics like occupancy modeling or distribution records or even the literature around natural history, or if it was about policy like the way that the ESA came to be or different biodiversity policies, Al would give you an authoritative response. You knew that it was well thought out, it was carefully crafted, and it was accurate above all else. And he was a go-to reference for so many topics in the freshwater fish world. Al was very curious, and it, we we at DFO have never met someone who is such an incredible natural historian at all levels of biological organization. Al was the kind of person that when driving to a field site and stepping out of the car, without moving his feet, he could look around and name between 50 and 100 species, common and scientific name, just by observation. And from all different levels of organization, well beyond fishes, grasses, birds, you name it. He was just remarkable at his natural history skills. Many of us who know Al know that he was very detail oriented in everything that he did, whether it was his primary publications in the academic realm, looking at occupancy, or even the teaching that he did. He was extremely detailed oriented. And he joked with me once that, quote, Andrew, I don't make mistakes, end quote. And as much as he was joking, he really did have a knack for understanding the importance of accurate, detailed information. One of the things that made Al wonderful to work with is that we would often have him as a reviewer on different DFO papers. And there were many times that Al pointed out the error in our ways and things that perhaps we should have considered before getting to the final stage of a publication. And these pictures here are a particular memory where we had gotten close to publishing some grain size analysis for Eastern Sand Darter reintroduction work. And following Al's review comments, he correctly pointed out that perhaps we needed another larger sieve on the top of our sieve stack. So to the chagrin of our lab technicians, we had to reweigh all of our sediment samples. But of course, Al was right. And that eye for detail ultimately led to a much better scientific product. And that was the effect that he had on so many of these papers. Al was collaborative and he was very generous with his time. So we heard from Nick about his role on COSEWIC and COSERO, guest lectures at UTSC, and adjunct professor status at UTSC. Just the sheer volume of DFO sampling and collaborative projects he undertook with us. He was on many Sarah recovery teams. And, in particular, he was always available for informal advice. As Scott mentioned, he loved nothing more than sitting down and talking about the plan for any given project. He was just a born mentor. Um, and certainly in his mentorship activities, he reminded us of the importance of thinking about people who come before us. So remember those who have laid the foundation for the research that we are carrying on. We've heard a lot about Al's humor, and he had one of the driest, most wonderful senses of humor of anyone I've ever worked with. Uh, it would be common to get review comments from Al, in track changes or word bubbles. And one in particular that stood out for us was, quote, Rainbow darter are muscular beasts compared to sand noodles, of course, talking about Eastern sand darter. Um, I remember as well when he was initiating his PhD sampling, he had rented this really tiny subcompact Hyundai. It was this little red, I think it was a Hyundai Accent, and he lovingly referred to it as his red sports car. So we had that thing jammed with seining material and recovery bins and all the rest of it. And just his humor kind of came out in everything that he did, and it made it so enjoyable to work with him. He was positive and optimistic, yet very realistic. And, I remember talking to him once about, thinking about where we might be headed in terms of a certain government initiative. And I was kind of getting a little bit down on some of the future prospects. And he was quick to remind me that Ontario's living legacy was created at a time where you might not have expected large scale government investment into conservation initiatives. Al was very people focused, and he felt very strongly about treating people well and about connecting with old friends and connecting with old colleagues and recognizing the value of the people that are involved in the work that we did in government. And, there are many wonderful examples of Al having get-togethers at his house, or, as Nick mentioned, sampling retreats. And you could tell he really enjoyed getting together with colleagues who have a shared interest in terms of these freshwater fishes that Al loves so passionately. And what I was amazed about is in the last year of Al's life, he made it a priority to connect with colleagues, and seeing him at the last COSEWIC freshwater fishes subcommittee meeting was a real honor and a pleasure, because you could tell that Al was in a lot of pain. And I think the last thing I want to close on here is Al's passion. He exuded passion for biodiversity, for science, for translocations, for species at risk, and for his hobbies. He talked often about canoe trips to Algonquin, or the hunting he was doing, or the fishing trip that he had just done. But most importantly, Al talked about passion for his family. And I always really enjoyed hearing stories about what his two daughters, Hillary and Avery, were up to. He was so proud when he told those stories. He had recently been to BC to help with some field work for his daughter's master's project, and he just had an incredible slideshow to go along with that trip. And he also talked a lot about adventures with Helen, what they were up to, what they had been doing, and you could just tell that passion really came out in everything that Al did. And so, with that, I'm really thankful to be able to have known Al and to give this talk um, and reflect on a wonderful man. And we'll just open the floor to questions or memories that folks may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Are there any questions or anything anyone would like to share? Well, I'd like to thank the three of you sincerely for sharing your memories of Al and his research. In light of Al's contribution to the field of fish ecology in Ontario, the American Fisheries Society's Ontario chapter would like to rededicate our President's Award for Best Student Poster in remembrance of Al Dextrase. So we hope the award will continue to support students in this field. And we've also recorded this session, so we can distribute that afterwards. So, and thank you very much to those of you who've joined us remotely. So,
Eric, can I just have one last comment?
sure.
Maybe this is already self-explanatory and implicit from these three presentations. But to younger, to younger professionals who are at this meeting, or even just to all of us, that, Al served as a wonderful example of who you can be as a person and a professional. And so if you be positive, if you think about others, if you take time to invest in others, not only will it have a wonderful impact on other people, but I truly believe it will enhance your own experience. And so, and to me, that is a real lesson learned from being a friend and colleague of Al. And something not easy for me, doesn't come naturally for me, but something I aspire to be better at.
Thank you very much, Scott. This has been quite a moving session. And I think we'll bring it to a close now, unless anyone else has anything that they'd like to add. Well, thank you all for joining us. And I'm going to ensure that this recorded session is available to all of you.